Welcome to the TFT Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Sullivan, and today we are talking to Bill Smart. Bill is a high-performance strength and conditioning coach who works at High Performance NZ, who caters for New Zealand's most elite athletes. In today's episode, we discuss Bill's involvement with City Kickboxing and how he has introduced a high-performance system to optimize their training schedule. We discuss the changes he has made, the metrics they are now tracking, and we cover what the ideal strength and conditioning program is for fighters. This is a great episode, so let's get to it. All right, welcome back to another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast. Today I'm joined by a very special guest all the way from New Zealand. I'm joined by Bill Smart. Bill, thanks for coming on, mate.
Jordy, I appreciate you having me on the show.
No, appreciate you coming. I completely got the time zones wrong, and Bill has been kind enough to shift his schedule and still make this work. So that is my bad. But for everyone listening, Bill, give us the elevator pitch. For those who don't know you, tell us who you are and what you do.
Cheers. So my name is Bill Smart. I work within in New Zealand, if you're from not New Zealand, at high performance sport here, which is essentially our New Zealand Olympic training system. I work in Cambridge, which is a small part in New Zealand, and primarily sort of work in cycling at the moment. So primarily cycling, BMX, and have worked in our rowing system as well. Outside of that, I work with the City Kickboxing guys from a performance standpoint, which is much of what we'll talk about today, and then also have worked with our national boxing program as well.
Yeah, awesome. And Bill, you've been on the fight scene for a very long time. Tell us about how you got started there and how your beginnings became as a strength conditioning coach in combat sports.
Yeah, so I've been with high performance sport for roughly sort of 8 years now, and working sort of with international athletes for closer to 9 years. For me, it's an interesting, I guess, I've probably got an interesting start point. The big sports in New Zealand have always been your rugby, your rowing, your cycling, so forth. And I've always been a big performance guy, but for the most part, combat sports has always been sort of where my passion has lied. And, if I'm being honest with you, combat sports and MMA in particular has really been the only sport that I have actually followed very closely, which has always, been a passion project of mine. So throughout sort of the years of working in high performance and in all these other environments, working in combat sports outside of that, more so from a private sort of perspective or level, has always been something that I've done in addition to that.
Yeah, awesome. And for anyone who watched UFC 305 that was in Perth just a couple of weekends ago, if you were listening to the commentators, they were constantly referencing whenever a City Kickboxing fighter was competing, the new strength conditioning program that's been put in place at City Kickboxing. They were mentioning, all the guys look in phenomenal shape. They look like they're in phenomenal condition. Bill, you played a big role in that. Can you explain to us what that was and what did you do when you went in there?
Cheers for that, Jordy. Yeah, definitely. I mentioned just before we started, took me by a bit of surprise. I think essentially what we looked at with City Kickboxing is, applying some principles, some sports science principles, or some of the areas or values that we have in high performance, and trying to translate that a little bit more over into essentially the program that they do. So a big part of what we did was we reevaluated the program and some of the processes, particularly around data collection, and just started to formalize things. And I mean, primarily the goal was to, at starting point, gain information and take what was there and help to optimize it.
Yeah, so talk us through then, Bill, when you went to City Kickboxing, what were some of the big ticket items then that you looked at and you're like, okay, these are the things we need to collect data on. These are the things we need to start making changes on.
Yeah, I think like for me, what's like the perspective is really important. I've spent a lot of time in these big sporting systems, like rowing, cycling, where everything is very polished and very developed. Um, and with that, what you have is you have these systems in place that sort of have been there for a while, and all the training is based around those systems. So, sort of going into kickboxing, like I think I just was in a call with a guy called John Wilson, who's one of our senior S&Cs down south, and he sort of referred to it as like the different ecosystems of different sports, which I think is a really great way to sort of coin it. Is that we have like these sports that have been around for a while that have had a lot of funding, especially sort of pumped into them, and as a result, like the journey of the sport has gone from something that's quite small and then developed. Um, and when you look at, I guess, combat sport, MMA, and no different at CKB, is that you essentially have like a sport that is that hasn't had that pathway of development like these other sports because they haven't had the resourcing that's gone into them. And essentially, the journey of the sport often starts with the coach. Coach does everything. Coach is the S&C, coach is the physio, coach is the dietitian. And then sort of as things start to progress, and especially as resources start to come in, there are more supporting staff that sort of play roles, and the ability to have people who specialize in their expertise starts to develop around the board. So we've sort of seen City Kickboxing as, especially in New Zealand, as a gym that has been very successful and has sort of started that journey. But essentially, for me, it was from a performance perspective and the processes that come along with that, that was something that was very much still on the table to be developed.
So I guess what you're saying then, Bill, is that because MMA is such a young sport, it's not developed, doesn't have huge funding like the rugby, the rowing, and all these other sports. Are we saying that we don't particularly have this ideal pathway or this ideal model just yet that's been polished and refined over years and years and years? That if you could just walk into an MMA gym and just go, hey, here you go, let's insert this here and then put this complete training system in. If we don't have that, what is it that you do, or what is the best practice for these MMA guys then?
Yeah, 100%. I think like what's important to understand with MMA as well is MMA is still a very young sport. So even when we consider like that those progression points, like we're still finding out so much about MMA. Like our understanding of MMA and how things tick, so to speak, it's still relatively little. Um, so essentially, I think the way things like prior have run is oftentimes we're trying not to miss things, and we're doing as much as possible just to um, not miss things, whether it's different components from a fitness perspective, from a strength or skill perspective. But what comes with that is sort of the inability to hone in and be very precise with things, and sort of being able to hit the nail on the head. We kind of just smash everything. So essentially, like what we wanted to do is, and actually just to backtrack a little bit, City Kickboxing, an amazing gym, great culture, fantastic skill, but hadn't necessarily had the expertise to start to fine tune some of those processes from a physical and sports science standpoint. And that was kind of like one of the bigger goals. And like when you look at someone like Eugene, Mike, and Andre, like specialized, very good at what they do and their areas. And I remember one of the comments that Eugene made was, like we don't do what we did 6 to 12 months ago in training, but we've been doing the same training system for the last 7 years. And I think that was sort of where it began in terms of starting to um, look into things a little bit closer.
Yeah. So Bill, I mean, what are the things that you're looking at? I guess if we were to break this down, just so the guys at home can start understanding, could you talk to us in terms of simple things like, say, energy systems, or how are you evaluating MMA as a sport? If you're coming in, you're looking at it, you're going, okay, well, we have these certain things that we need to develop. Obviously, we've got the Andres, we've got the Mikes who are going to do the skills. But if we want to develop these guys as athletes and get them conditioned and get them strong, what are the systems that you're looking at and going, okay, that's really important for MMA?
Yeah, so it's quite vast. I think like when you look at it, if I sort of break down like the approach that we took, it was like what does the structure of training look like in terms of the processes that start things off. So when we look at energy systems, it's we have like the energy systems that are relevant for fighting, and like to a certain extent, all the energy systems are relevant to MMA. And then it's where do we put them, and then it is from there how do we sort of optimize within those sessions. Like the first thing we looked at is the big picture schedule as a whole. So prior we had a fight camp, and that was essentially your primary formalized block of training. And then those off camps periods were a little bit more open to interpretation. So my one of the big things that we started with was starting to formalize that off camp and sort of how that process looked, whether or not that's going from when you fight into your base preparations prior to camp. And then what we started to look at from there is what's happening at current. So like how do we get a gauge of what the training is resulting in, and sort of what the rabbit hole that led down was. Now we're starting to look at collecting some information when it comes to. At first, we implemented a wellness or a recovery system, which we're collecting data for. The next part was we started collecting physical data, so one from an energy system perspective, and one from like a strength and power perspective. And a big part of sort of phase one, and I want to talk about it being like phase one was make the big changes, which was mostly around that structure. And there was some recovery points in there that we can touch on a little bit later. And then it was, what's this resulting in, and is it resulting in what we want essentially? And I think a lot of the times, especially for the coaches, coaches will have a good idea of what they want training to result in, but you're able to observe so much from a skill perspective, but from a physical perspective, applying some of those data points gives us like a very good gauge of what's happening at these different time points.
What are those data points that you collect and Bill? You mentioned the wellness and recovery, and then also the strength and power. What are those data points?
Yeah, so it's been pretty comprehensive, and I'm quite happy with. I think like the information gathering is for me such a big thing because I really want to be able to hone in on things very specifically. So in terms of the recovery work, there was a couple of things we added. One of them was a wellness questionnaire, so looking at like a subjective gauge of training, so something they do every day, as well as HRVs. So those were the two check-ins that we had from a recovery standpoint. And for me, it was, we know that training load is high for MMA, and it always will be. It's a sport that is very vast in terms of all the technical, tactical components, and it's very demanding in terms of the conditioning components. So it's kind of like, well, we know training load is going to be high. We want to get a gauge of how athletes are responding to that. And then based on that, potentially we get better ideas of where we can make some shifts. So that was sort of part one.
What's a HRV for the people at home who don't know, Bill?
So HRV is heart rate variability. Essentially, like when you take your sort of heartbeats, it's the regularity between your heartbeats. And it gives us a little bit of information on essentially how your parasympathetic nervous system operates. So as we train, as we accumulate stress, what we influence our nervous systems, and what we want to see is that essentially, well, what we want to see when it comes to the tracking of that is how regular is this? When there are shifts that indicate nervous system fatigue, are they at the points in time at which they should be? And are they in the trends that they should be? And if they're not in the trends that they should be, then potentially we have sort of some room to make some change. And I think like the big premise of a lot of this is like there's two parts to it. Is like we test like with the testing protocols that we've set up, we have one prior to off camp. We have one at the end of off camp, which is sort of the recovery week before the camp starts. And then we have one in the deload week, which is sort of 5 weeks out. So like relatively close together. You're looking at sort of 4 weeks between testings. But what that sort of gives us is a pretty good indicator of what's happening at different time points, in which case we have the ability to make shifts quickly for the next block if something isn't where we want it, maybe pivots in training, or it lets us evaluate and do things better in the future. And I think that's probably one of the bigger things. Going back to your question earlier, like what are some of the differences from some of these more developed systems? And when it comes to operating at an elite level, and some of these Olympic sports, like you're basically always just trying to hit the nail on the head. And it's never as simple as doing the same thing. It's always measuring, monitoring, and then remeasuring, and just seeing how close do we get. And that's a constant process. So this is sort of the start of that.
And what were some of the strength and power data that you guys started implementing there, Bill?
So we've taken a lot of inspiration from the UFC, and I've been pretty fortunate to have a couple of good contacts there that have helped with that process. So Gavin Pratt, who's the global performance director, has been amazing. Roman Verman, who's the sports scientist at the UFC, and Dean Ammersinger as well from Shanghai. So all those guys have sort of been quite helpful. Essentially, what we look at is we do a jump profile, which is counter movement jump, body weight, 20% body weight, 40% body weight. We look at reactive strength through a drop jump. We assess maximal lower body strength through an isometric mid-thigh pull. We do a landmine punch, which is sort of like a upper body, full body dynamic push movement. We do a rotational power test as well on a Kaiser. And then we use something called an OC rig, which is essentially our alactic test, but it's a power bike that has the ability to not just give you peak power, but peak power at different cadences. So essentially we get a force velocity curve off it, but we get to see how do you produce like power at high speed, which is quite a nice niche test that we have as a part of our system here in New Zealand.
Yeah, and talk to us about that, Bill. And I know we spoke about it a little bit before, but those energy systems that you're testing, can you kind of break that down a little bit more, like what they are and why exactly you're testing them? Like why are they important for fighting?
So I think when you look at we've got our base energy systems, we've got our aerobic system, we've got our lactic system or glycolytic system, and then we've got our alactic system or phosphagen system. And those are sort of very brief labels for each. When you look at MMA, I think what's like really important to note, we touched on, how vast MMA is, but, there's many ways to achieve an outcome in MMA. But there's also so much to train. It's very hard to do everything at once. And, a lot of, you probably heard the saying, you try and do everything, you get nothing, which, often is the case when it comes to training, is that we just try to do everything, especially in a camp setting, is that we try to hit all of these. And as a result, we sort of water down the training effect and our ability to recover and adapt from it. So what we look at is we look at assessing those three systems. So we have a look at the aerobic system, we've got a VO2 max. For the lactic system, we do a 60-second assault bike glycolytic capacity test. which is absolutely disgusting. Shout out to Roman and Gavin for that one from the UFC. And then we primarily use our OC rig, which we touched on before, so our alactic testing. Really, I just want to see if there's an area that is deficient at first. So that's kind of the starting point, is where are you relative to baseline. If you're below baseline, then that becomes one of those areas that we really want to level up. Um, Essentially, by doing that, we're able to distribute our training in a way that we can really target the areas that are work-ons. And as a result, you're not trying to do everything at once, and you do get a lot better a lot faster. And that's been a process that so far is still relatively new to some of the CKB stuff, but has been quite successful. And Kevin Jusay is a really good example of someone who we've applied this to, and his sort of time prior to camp start, and just seen massive changes, which is fantastic.
So, Bill, that's a good lead into this next question, right? Because you're 100% right. It doesn't matter if it's your diet, doesn't matter if SNC, anything. You try to do everything at once, you're probably not going to get very far. Like, you really got to like separate it out and dial in on one thing. How do you manage that though, Bill? Like you said, in a sport with MMA, where there's so many different components. Like you said, there's 100 different ways to win. You knock someone out in 3 seconds, it's the same as a 5-round war, same result, same outcome, two very, very different physiological fights that went on. How do you go about if you get all this data and you go, hey, Geordie, you need to work on your lactic power, but you're about to start camp? Is this a case of, okay, we'll address this next camp? Do you address it in camp? Do you pull your strength conditioning sessions and address it there? How do you go about interpreting this data and then applying it in the real world?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it is like there's always a balance with it. I think like primarily we one of the big pushes for the off camp was that really the off camp is the time period when you get better physically. And not to say that you can't get better in camp, but there's just a lot more scope to get better during that off camp. So one of the in terms of the protocols for that, one of the big shifts has been that some of the technical workload or technical volume has come down during the off camp, and there's more time spent on the physical side of things and gearing that towards. Of course, it's not something we can do for everybody, but it's something that's becoming more common practice with some of the more competitive guys gearing their work-ons in that off-camp period. Has led to some like quite favorable changes in the areas that they need to. The downside with the testing is that you're kind of just taking stabs at the dark and doing what you think should make sense because it's relevant. But I think what's very apparent is, especially when you start testing people, is that everyone has like what makes people tick can be quite different. And everyone's quite different based on their physiology and essentially how they were born. And then there's training factors as well in that, but being able to target that is how we get a bit more out of it. When we go to camp, there's definitely still scope to make those changes as well. It's just the understanding that because the training volume is higher, the technical loading is higher, the potential for change is not as high. But what we can do, and this is something that we've started doing, is started to distribute some of those conditioning sessions to be a little bit more targeted based on someone's work-ons versus just having the blanket approach that's sort of always been there.
And how would you balance then, Bill, if you were looking across, say, the City Kickboxing training schedule over the week and you go, okay, there's these big picture goals that you say the coaches, Eugene, Mike, Andre, want these athletes to get out from a technical, tactical, and then, technical conditioning. There is a wrestling conditioning, there is a kickboxing conditioning, there's cage wrestling conditioning that you build up during camp. How do you balance that with going, okay, you guys want to get this done. I know for this athlete, we need to get this done. We can't do everything at once. How do you balance that plate?
Yeah, 100% good call. And like this is probably the area that we're looking into sort of for like I want to say phase two is how to optimize this a little bit better for some of the set sessions. But essentially how it's looked currently is, some of those sessions there is scope to shift them in certain ways. depending on the outcomes that the coaches want, and then the outcomes that maybe suit them a little bit more physically. So there has been the case that we're able to just mold the session just to repackage it a little bit in a way to have the opportunity to tick both those boxes. On the other side, there are some conditioning based sessions that are maybe energy system sessions in there that have the ability to be, I guess, like swing sessions, so to speak. So have the ability to shift emphasis depending on the person. And that's one thing that we've done with Kevin this camp. We've made a couple of shifts based on what essentially what he's very good at and areas that he's, I don't want to say not good at, but not as gifted, which is pretty exciting.
And Bill, this is always a point that I've found very interesting, right? Because I think in a lot of sports, you can break things down like rugby, for example, and you can almost get a template for a rugby player and you distribute it between positions, right? Like you've got your front rowers, and there's generally a physiological profile for front rowers, and then there's inside backs and outside backs, and you can generally get a physiological profile. And you often see in these team environments, right? When they go off and do strength conditioning, inside backs go off, outside backs, forwards, loose forwards go over here, tight, and they split it all up. It's very, very specific to them. When it comes to MMA, we walk into the gym more often than not. It's a class environment. We're doing our technical skills. We're doing this. But to do all that, you need to do it all together. So you've got all these different individuals, and then you've got all these different individual needs. Is there ever going to be a time, you think, Bill, when there will be a template physiological ideal for an MMA fighter? Or is it the case that, you know what, there's probably 20 different ways to skin this cat and it's just whatever works for you? Which one is it?
Great call. And I don't, I again, like I think the template approach is okay when you're working with development athletes or athletes who are less experienced, or the competition level is not as high. I think like in general, the way that I look at training is there are just certain base competencies that we need to have. Whether or not it's like base movement competency, it's having the right aerobic base, it's having the right strength base. I think for me those things those things are very important. But they're also, that's only here. We're looking to operate up here. And I think that when it comes to, maximizing somebody, especially at a high competition level and an elite level, everyone's different. And, I think one of the biggest positives that come out of this, and, I think one of the big things again was that data collection is you really can see how that's reflected like through the data from like a strength power profile, from a conditioning profile, in terms of just regardless, you've got all these guys who have trained in the same system for years and years, yet they present very differently in terms of the physical attributes that they have. And all of a sudden, like, that highlights just that it's not enough when it comes to trying to optimize. And when we set out to put this together, I did a presentation for the gym, and this was to outline the program. One of the big like pushes that I had at the start of that was, everyone around the world is getting better at a rapid pace. We've got the UFC PI who is accessible, who's putting out all this great information. That's becoming more common around the world. Like, as well as that, when you look at the research that's come out of MMA in the last 5 years, I think it's like fivefold higher than the decade before that. So like the sport's accelerating from a sports science standpoint very quickly. And if you don't if you don't work to keep up with that, people are going to do this. And for me, that's quite scary. And having the right processes is what helps you sort of keep that going, because everyone will keep getting better. You just have to get better too.
Bill, we're talking about elite level, tip of the sphere athletes, City Kickboxing, one of the best MMA gyms, not just right now, but of all time in our current generation. what about the guys just at home who are going, you know what, I'm not at that level yet. I'm just an amateur. I'm maybe just a new professional. I got lots of time to develop. Is doing this type of really dialed in assessment, data collection, the wellness and recovery data, the strength and power data, is that as relevant for these guys, or should they be taking a different approach?
It's a great call, and I might get a little bit controversial here. I think there's multiple components to it. I honestly believe that, like I'm very much a science data driven person, right? Like um I want to have the ability to quantify things, and I want to have like to manipulate, because that allows me to make these really valuable small changes. When it comes to you bring the level down a little bit. I do believe being too scientific too early can cause problems as well as the other side. So I think there's problems on both sides. Um, I think that what is really important is having good work ethic and having good work capacity as a result of that. That's one part. Like that's one part of it. You need a like you need to be. It's easier to work with the guy that you have to pull back than the guy you have to push forward. That makes sense. But like alongside that, you really need people that take responsibility for themselves. So you have the ability to push, but you also can take responsibility when it comes to things like your food, when it comes to tracking things like weight, um, wearing your heart rate monitor. I think both are very important. But if you only have the science, if you only look at this and you don't have the ability to push through hard things, it's very hard to do well in the long run. If you only push through hard things and you don't have the discipline to take care of these other things outside of that, then the same problem exists on the other side. So I do think both is very important. But going back to what we talked about, um, generally you want to have a good base, and then once you start measuring, that takes you to the next level. If you don't have a good base, it's good to have baseline still, um, but you're not going to get the same return as you would.
What would you say then, Bill, to someone who's getting into MMA, or maybe, yeah, they're just starting out? And we touched on it before that there's all these multiple different components of a performance, right? Like you've got your conditioning, which is, you can go out there and can you stay on your feet? Can you keep swinging? Can you keep wrestling? Can you get up? Can you sprawl? Can you do everything else? Then there's the technical aspect. Do you actually physically know how to throw a punch? Do you know how to finish a triangle? Do you know how to get off the cage when someone's got you pinned up against and they've got an underhook? But then there's also the tactical, right? There's the game plan aspect. Can I execute it? And when it gets up to this elite level, every little one of those and every little component matters. How much do each of those components matter when you're just getting started out in this, and when you're someone coming up, or even if you're a younger professional, maybe you've had one or two pro fights and you've still got your whole career ahead of you? How much do all of those components matter then, especially if we're talking about the conditioning side of it?
Yeah, great call. I think for me, like there's a hierarchy of like importance when it comes to sport and skill. And like base of the pyramid, you've got like skill comes first, right? Um, and if you compromise skill for something else, you're gonna run into a wall pretty quickly. Then the next one is like you need to be fit, but you need base fitness. You need to be aerobically fit. So that's sort of like your next one. And then I'd sort of say probably under that, but around the same like side is like you need to be healthy. Like if you're not healthy, if you don't have the technical ability, it's very hard to just train properly. Then when we're fit, we have the ability to execute those for a longer period of time. Um, and we sort of work up there. Then we start to look at things like strength, things like power, become a little bit higher up there in terms of those important areas. For me, I think for people starting out, it's good to get a strong routine down. And generally, how that looks is, skill comes first. What are the primary skill sessions that I need to be doing per week? And honestly, like from my observations in combat sport, like the people who do more skill early get better faster and get to that point faster, and then they hit a wall as soon as essentially that starts to wear out. Um, once you've dialed in the skill sessions that you need to do, now where does my conditioning sit around this? Like, and as someone who is maybe not dialing things in as much based on testing, for me, then it looks like, well, what aren't I getting in the training that I'm doing? So whether or not like the way that looks is getting into some of your anaerobic, maybe it's lactic power sets, alactic power sets. Maybe if you're less fit, it's looking at getting to some of your like aerobic based training. Maybe it's a zone two or it's a like aerobic power set. Generally, I'm going to look at what type of conditioning is happening in the sports trainings, and I'm going to try and do something that is not a part of that. Just gives me a bit more bang for buck. And then S&C around that becomes do I move well? Am I structurally sound? Am I structurally strong? Am I robust? And then am I strong? And that's generally how I would look at framing that. Um, maybe two S&C sessions a week or strength sessions a week, maybe 2 to 3 conditioning sessions, depending on how much skill I'm doing. And then trying to pencil in a recovery day primarily, and one day that's a light day would be my suggestion.
Bill, I got 2 more questions for you. I'm going to write one of them down.
There's a lot there, Jordy.
Before I forget it. Deload weeks. You implemented deload weeks into the City Kickboxing training schedule, which they never had, which I always found absolutely crazy, especially when you work with those guys for long, when you know how much they torch themselves in the gym, and especially when you train yourself, and if you work with other athletes, when it seems every other athlete, well, not just every other athlete, every other sport seems to do deload weeks. How did that come about? What did you notice? And talk to us about the purpose and why deload weeks are very, very useful for this sport, especially in a fight camp setting.
Like, yeah, you're right. Like structured recovery it's a tool, and it's quite a powerful tool because we look at it's going like general adaptation syndrome as basically I train, I get worse, and then I recover and I get better. So like which in a very basic sense, when you look at MMA and just how much training volume there is, it's sort of one of the first things that I look at is, well, how do you manage that and just not have these guys just completely burnt out? And you could like the counter to that could be, well, they did it for so long, but what does that sort of manifest in terms of like the quality and actually what you get out of the training that you're putting in? And I think that the concept of there's training done, but then there's training that I get better from, that I adapt from, and that's the premise of it is that by having these recovery weeks at different stages, I have the ability to push harder, and when it comes to training, and I have the ability then to also recover and get better from it. You'll find that aside from that recovery factor, you athletes are gonna find strategies to work around that. And generally, what those strategies look like is like limiting output, or conserving in different areas. And as much as they will say that isn't the case, if you were to measure power, say if they're doing work on an assault bike, you're going to see that reflected in like the power and the output they're able to put out. So as soon as we strategically put in these recovery periods, we have the ability then to push things a little bit harder, but then come out of that and have a little bit more get a little bit more from that.
Perfect. And last question before I let you go, Bill. This is going to be hard to answer too. And I know there's a lot of nuance. Everyone's different, but I need you to give me your best answer. If you could pick the best exercises for the MMA athlete that's listening to this, maybe they can't afford an S&C coach, maybe they can't afford the means to talk to people who know a bit better and they have to make it work. if you were to say to them, these are the best exercises for you as an MMA fighter to do in your strength conditioning sessions, what would they be?
Hard to I find it very hard to answer from a general framework, but um, we're talking in the gym, I guess,
Yeah,
like strength.
they've got a kitted out gym, they've got an
Um,
assault bike, they've got
oh yeah, that
weights, they've got all the
yeah.
equipment. Imagine they're a dead broke fighter, but they've got one of the best gyms in the world that they go to somehow.
Okay. So components. I'm going to try not to be too complicated, but components of uh, MMA performance from a gym perspective, you've got like lower body is obviously very like is big, right? So like there's a lot of studies that highlight that if you want to punch harder, lower body power is a large contributor to that. Big fan of the trap bar deadlift as a lower body exercise to sort of help to maximize that from a force standpoint, and also thinking that almost everybody who's recreational, almost every like most a lot of people probably not as strong as they should be. So that's probably my big lift in terms of lower body. I think it's very important to train the feet. So I think whether or not it's training them to be reactive or training them to be strong is important. So things like pogo jumps are great, single leg pogo jumps, balance work. If you've ever like played on a slack line and things like that, it's fantastic. And then like rotations, one of the biggest ones if you're a striker as well is you need to be able to producing power is really important in a linear plan, but you need to produce power rotationally because that's a big part of striking. So whether or not it's things like med ball rotational work, that's probably a big one as well. If you want to bang for your buck, upper body strength exercise, pull ups are great, like weighted pull ups. There's quite a large contribution from the lat in terms of rotational power as well. So that'd probably be from an S&C standpoint, my big one. From a conditioning standpoint, generally what people miss, and like if we just want to baseline things, is they miss the high heart rates and they miss the low heart rates. So a lot of the times, MMA athletes, they'll train a lot and training will be at about 80%, and they'll sort of consistently, if you were a heart rate monitor, be in sort of that orange zone. And you want to spend time above that, you want to spend time below that. I think that's quite important. So things like intervals above 90% heart rate is quite beneficial, maybe 3 minutes, while having 2 minutes rest. And then maybe things like your sort of zone 2 based training outside of that, which you can actually do quite a lot of, and it's relatively low cost, which might be lower heart rates depending on who you are, sort of 125 to 150 at a sort of steady state pace, from 25 to 90 minutes for your general person. Probably 45 minutes would work quite well. But yeah, that's quite a big one. The high heart rate one is quite a big one. It's I remember when I was in America at the Olympic Center and talking to the USA boxing physiologist slash trainer. That's been one of their big things that they have emphasized over the years. Basically, because when you look at a boxing fight, almost the entire fight is spent above 93% heart rate, and if you don't spend time there in training, and then you only spend time there in competition, you're going to struggle. And that's sort of the premise of that, which I think is just that concept is quite important.
Is a brilliant answer, Bill, and I'm sure you're going to help a lot of young athletes out with that. So there you go. There's basically the blueprint of how to get your S&C kick started. But once you get started, you will no doubt need a hand in the future, and that is where you're going to need to contact someone like Bill Smart. Now, Bill, say if they did want to contact you and someone wanted to reach out, get more info from you, what's the best way for them to do that?
I appreciate that, Geordie. So you can probably the best way to find me is Instagram. You can find me under Smarter underscore performance, I believe. And yeah, pretty happy. Like I think especially for combat sport, it's it's a big passion of mine. I enjoy discussing it and helping, and pretty happy if anyone wants to has any questions to help field some of those.
Awesome. All right, Bill Smart, thanks so much for that episode. That was amazing, mate, and no doubt we'll chat again soon.
Cheers, Jordan. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.